If you're leading a small data team or you're one of the only engineers at your company, then you already know how important it is to be efficient with your time as well as the money that you spend. Everything tends to be a little bit more under a microscope. And in this video, what I want to talk about is one way in particular you can be more efficient, even as a small team, and actually it's probably more important. And that has to do with naming conventions and the alignment you have across your data stack and your data projects. So what I want to do here is actually hop over to this other screen and walk through this idea of naming alignment on data teams. So when I work with teams one-on-one, one of the first things that we actually do is complete an audit. And effectively what that is we'll go through step by step and look at their project. This includes things like their database, DBT setup, their Git repo, security roles, all types of things like that, and understand what they're doing today. And this is one of the first things that tends to pop out, especially, like I said, with the smaller teams, because it won't be super consistent. So when we talk about their database, for example, we're talking about names of the warehouses, the schemas, DBT project. What are they calling their project? How are they naming their folders and directories? And does it align with what's actually being deployed in the database? The same thing applies for the naming convention of branches while you're going through the workflow. Does it actually make sense, or are you just kind of skipping over it? Then security roles. Do the names of the actual roles and users, does it align with what they're actually doing with those user groups? I have different videos that talk about recommended approaches for naming conventions of all these things. But the point I want to make here is these are things that might seem different or unique in isolation, and you'll work on them individually. But in order to be an efficient, well-oiled machine, you want a lot of these things to be working together and to look at it like a system, to look at it from a higher architectural level and understand how to keep things more aligned. And so that's what we're going to talk about here in this video. So here's an example of 4 components and 4 different naming conventions. For example, you might have one thing, maybe it's your database, that's called Analytics Prod. This was the name of the first database I worked on for the first team I was on. But then you might have, let's say, the DBT project called DBT underscore, the name of your company or something else. You might have another component, data dash warehouse, and then a role called prod RW role or just something else. The whole idea here is that individually they might make sense as you were building them, but when you look at them together as a whole, it's hard to tell at a quick glance what is happening here and if they are representing the same thing, if they're supposed to be a union. It's not only inconsistent in the actual naming, but are you using underscores, dashes, little things like that? It just doesn't have a cohesive feel. So why am I talking about all this stuff? Well, why does this happen? It's not necessarily on purpose, or at least I don't believe so. A lot of teams were doing things fairly quickly, and it tends to be overlooked. And it's easy to talk about this in theory, but it's just so much easier not to do it. And I think that is the crux of this here. And I want to explain why it's still worth doing it. Now, one last thing before we actually get into why this is important, I want to talk about some of the reasons that it comes up, at least things I hear for, when I ask somebody why this is in place. Here are some of the reasons, or at least things I've also personally experienced. Number one, you might say, well, we'll fix it later. And the reality is that's not going to happen until things get really messy or really out of hand and you need to do a whole migration. You're probably not going to fix certain things like that, especially foundational concepts like the name of a database, like folder directories, things like that. It's so much easier to just put it in place and never touch it again. It's not that you don't want to fix it later or you don't have the intention. It just rarely happens. And you have to understand that when you make those decisions. And that's why I'm trying to point that out, that it's really important. You might say it's not a big deal. I think it is, as we'll talk about. Or maybe you just didn't think about it. You just went through it and didn't even realize that this is going to be a problem, because you might think, oh, it's just names, it's just naming convention. But as you'll see, this is actually important. This might just be an awareness gap. And if this happens to be the case, well, hopefully this video will be serving as a reminder for you. Okay, so now let's actually get to the case for doing it, why it's worth taking a look at this. Let's talk about these one at a time. Number one, easy to explain. When you have very clear conventions that are consistent for, let's say, different layers in your data pipeline, maybe you have a staging layer, all of those models are named a certain way. You have data warehouse, those models are named a certain way, and marts, etc. It's very easy to just quickly identify what something represents just by looking at it. The naming convention alone does a lot of the heavy lifting. If it's prefixed with, let's say, the letters STG for a staging layer, staging environment, and that is aligned with your DBT project model directories, and that's aligned with your custom schema in your database, all these things work together. And anytime you see that model, you know where it lives, what it's doing, what it represents very quickly, and you don't have to have somebody explain that every single time. Whereas if you just had some random names and weren't really following that, it becomes a lot more difficult. Another example here could be with the name of the roles. So let's say you have a role called analyst or loader. That's going to be pretty clear, at least who that role is intended for, as opposed to something a little bit more vague or something with a bunch of confusing acronym letters that nobody really really knows what it is. Somebody has to figure out, is that the right role to use? Is that for me? What is this? Keeping it clear, keeping it simple is going to save you a lot of time, and it's just going to be easier to explain. And I think this is probably self-explanatory as well. It's easier to navigate. You understand where things live. You can tie it together between those different components. Remember, we talked about the database, the Git project, DBT, the roles. It'll be much easier to navigate around and understand what things tie together so that you can be more effective in using it and not have to bother other people to figure it out. And speaking of which, onboarding is going to be a lot easier, mainly because hopefully there will be less tribal knowledge of some of these things because the naming conventions are clear and everyone can understand it. It's easier for somebody, even if they're brand new, to understand what's in place, repeat the process, and be more effective and more efficient immediately rather than relying on you to explain everything. Speaking of efficiency, this is reason number two, and I think this is probably the biggest one. Maintenance is the highest cost in any data stack. It's a lot easier to get fixated on the cost of individual licenses, tools, and whatnot. And of course, those are important. You can't overlook those. But the actual cost most of the time is higher for individuals on the team. So unless you work for free, then I guess this doesn't apply to you. But for most people, they have salaries or they have contracted rates if you're a consultant or some sort of third party support. The time you spend on that has a very real cost. And so all of the time that you're spending trying to figure out these conventions is time that costs a very real money. So let's talk a little more specifically here about a couple examples. Number one, it's slower to figure things out. Like we've been talking about, if you don't have a consistent naming process or at least some sort of cohesive strategy around things, you have to figure it out every single time. And so it slows you down. It takes more mental bandwidth to figure it out. That's one of the things that when I was first getting into the DBT world, there was a saying, something along the lines of new lines are cheap, but brain power is expensive, which is really trying to emphasize the point that it actually costs a lot more, not only in mental bandwidth, but actually in cost to try to figure things out every time. Whereas if you just were a little bit more verbose or a little more clear with your code, then it would actually take you less time to figure it out. And in the very real sense here, less of your actual time spent on trying to figure it out. You can just get to the point right away and start making progress. Number two, it's harder to repeat work. If you don't have any sort of consistency every single time, you have to think about, what are you going to call something? What are you going to name it? What's the process here? And it's so much more difficult to go quickly because every time is like starting from scratch. Whereas if you have something clear and consistent, you can easily rinse and repeat it. There's no additional thought on that part there, and you can just move forward and be, again, more efficient. Another one here is constant task switching. So every little second adds up. If you have to constantly go and double check what something means or compare it to something else, every time you switch, you have to basically mentally start over. And it just takes you away from getting in that flow state to be productive, to figure out and accomplish whatever it is you were working on, because you're spending more time just trying to figure out what something means, what the convention is, etc. And then the last one here is hard to navigate, and the friction adds up across the whole project. And so a quick story on this: when I first got into data engineering, and one of my first jobs really was writing and managing really long store procedures. And initially, every time I would jump into a new store procedure, it was like entering a completely new world. It was all over the place. People had different ways of naming things, of structuring the query. Everything was really hard to understand and hard to then make changes. The first thing I would do is just reformat all the queries to align with something that was easy to read. That included spacing, capitalization, indentation, all of this stuff, to make sure that it was easy to read and I could understand what was actually happening. And once I did that, then I could move a lot quicker through the query because I could see what was going on. Before, everything was mixed up and there was just no consistency and it was hard to navigate. But then once it was clear and it was clean, I could go through it much quicker and be a lot more efficient and get a lot more done at the end of the day. So hopefully that example helps think about how that can add up, because every little moment you'd spend trying to resort and navigate something, again, is taking away from something else more productive that you could be doing. And all that time has a very real cost. All right, so number three, the last reason here, is that it's actually going to be easier to use new tech like AI when you have things more organized and consistent. Just like onboarding a human is going to be more difficult and challenging if you don't have consistency, just like we talked about in the previous reason, the same is true for AI coding agents and coding tools. If your project isn't consistent, AI tools have a tough time with it too. It has to try to figure it out on its own. The difference between a human and an AI tool, the AI tool is just going to run with it and do something on your behalf. A human might pause and ask a few more questions before moving forward, but either way, it's harder and you want to take advantage and be more efficient. So let's talk about a few examples of how this applies with AI agents specifically. So one example here is bulk changes break. An AI tool really just wants instructions and wants to follow that. If you're not consistent, it's going to give back inconsistent results. And what a lot of teams want to do is throw a bunch of stuff at an AI coding tool and have it just spit out the answers and solve everything for you. But as we keep saying, if you're not giving something consistent to work through, you're not going to get the results that you want. And you're going to end up spending more time manually reviewing. Actually, jumping ahead here, you're going to spend more of your time reviewing then you thought AI would actually save you. I think this is the case anyway for a lot of things currently. I think this will change over time. But if you're not consistent, you have to go through so much more to try to get it there. So the goal is to establish that up front and to be clear about what your strategy is higher level before going too much further. These are little things that add up. Hopefully that's the theme here that you're picking up. So we skipped over this one. Hard to leverage AI tools, just generally speaking. If everything is ad hoc, AI has nothing to lock onto. Like I said before, AI wants to have some sort of instruction. It wants clarity on what to do, and then it can just really run through it very quickly. If not, it's going to make its own interpretation, still go through it very quickly, but then you're going to spend all the time double checking if it's right. And at that point, you may not even know if it's right or what to say. You'll just agree with whatever it tells you. And that's just a recipe for more chaos in a project. So you definitely want to be responsible with this and have a strategy in place. And so this is why one of those things like naming conventions, even though it seems really small and nuanced and kind of unimportant, it actually is when you think about all the impact it can have on all these other items here that we're talking about. So the reality is nobody likes somebody nitpicking their work and being tedious with this kind of stuff. But the reality is this is one of those things. It feels a little passive aggressive sometimes when somebody is giving you those very specific instructions and critiques on your work. You'll tell yourself that you're going to get back to working on it, but it is incredibly important that you work through this, that you think about it, that you're deliberate about it, because it can pay dividends over the long haul, whether in a good way or it's going to cost you in the opposite direction and make you go off track a little bit. So it's something really important. And especially if you're getting started early or you have the opportunity to readdress that, that's a great thing to take a look at your naming conventions and just make sure it's all in alignment. Now, if any of this sounds like you, if you're on a smaller team and you want to make sure that your current process is on the right track, or you're getting started and you want to make sure you avoid this potential version where things are all over the place, then I'd love to help you out. I work with smaller teams all the time on this type of thing. Like I said before, we start with an audit and then go through the pipeline step by step to make sure what you have in place is good to go and ready to scale going forward with your team. So if that's something you're interested in, I'll leave a link below where you can schedule a free intro call with me. We'll talk through your situation and see if there's a good fit. And like I said, there'll be a link in the description. But either way, I want to say thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.